Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm your host, Alec MacDonald. This year, Taiwan's legislature has made international headlines for brawls on the debate floor. However, what are they really fighting over? Taiwan's main opposition parties, the Kuomintang or KMT, and the Taiwan's People Party or TPP, together hold a majority in the legislature, which they have used in attempts to pass controversial oversight bills. After the Constitutional Court struck down these bills, the court itself became a target. Today, to discuss the courts and Legislative Yuan, we are joined by Kharis Templeman, research fellow at the Hoover Institute. Kharis, welcome to the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, Kharis, I want to start off with the term constitutional crisis. And a recent analysis you did, you discussed this term and said that Taiwan is entering a time of constitutional crisis. Can you talk a little bit about what this means?
The most imminent problem is that the Constitutional Court right now in Taiwan does not have a full membership. So there are only 8 justices of the 15 in the court who hold office right now. And the crisis is that the legislature just passed a bill requiring a quorum of at least 10 justices to meet to hear any sort of challenges to laws based on their constitutionality. So we're in a position where the court can't actually rule on anything that the legislature does now. And despite that, the executive branch has asked the court to go ahead and rule on the constitutionality of the law that makes it impossible for them to rule on constitutionality of laws. So we're kind of caught in a limbo here. The court could decide that they have the right to review this law anyway. The legislature, I imagine, will probably react in a very harsh way towards the court if that happens. If they don't, though, they're stuck. They're in limbo and they can't do anything about any sort of challenge until and unless the legislature confirms a new slate of justices. There's another way you could have designed this law if you weren't trying to punish the court, which is to say this will take effect in 2 years from now. And that will give us time to seat new justices. The current makeup of the court, ability of the court to actually function won't be affected in the near term. But the opposition chose, I think, to take a more confrontational approach, and I don't think you can read it any other way. I think this was retaliatory against the court, and I think that is, unfortunately, a pretty direct attack on judicial independence in Taiwan.
Because of the reforms that Taiwan has gone under since democratization, I want to talk a little bit about the split between the executive yuan and the legislative yuan and some of the more structural reasons that have given rise to this uh, very partisan politicking right now.
The fundamental nature of Taiwan's constitutional framework now is it's basically a presidential regime. And that means there's separation of powers. That means that the executive and the legislative are elected by different constituencies, and they have what we call in political science separate survival. So they don't rely on the other side for confidence. And as a consequence of that, they both, I think, validly can claim a mandate from the voters to do what they see is the right thing to do for Taiwan. So Lai Ching-te can say, I beat both the TPP and the KMT candidate in the last election. Therefore, I have a mandate to lead the country. The voters chose me, not the other two parties. But the KMT and TPP can say the voters delivered us collectively a majority in the legislature. We have a mandate from the voters to do what we think is right for the country. So there's a kind of inherent tension to this constitutional system when you get a party winning the executive but not controlling a majority in the legislature. So if we get deeper into the problem here, typically for Taiwan, over at least for the last 16 years in Taiwan, the same party has controlled both branches. It's only when you've got divided government situation that you really see this kind of inherently adversarial relationship between the two branches emerge again. And then that puts a lot of pressure on the other parts of Taiwan's political system to adjudicate disputes between the two branches, in particular the Constitutional Court. And so the Constitutional Court has then become a political football in the partisan fight between the two other branches.
Do you think that this division will continue, or might there be a way found back to more normalcy in the current political environment?
I think the hope for all of us should be that there are some new norms that develop about what are kind of the appropriate limits to confrontation of the other branch. Let me sound a positive note here. When we look at the previous period of divided government in Taiwan, that was an unprecedented situation for everybody during the early Chen Shui-bian era. And in fact, there was some institutional innovation that occurred during that time. Both the major parties, both the DPP and KMT, agreed to significant constitutional reforms. In an ideal world, we'd see the two sides recognize that this current system has some significant flaws, especially when there's divided government.
So this is a good pivot point to go actually back to last May with the first investigative powers bill. Now, this was a bill that the KMT and TPP pushed forward through the Legislative Yuan, and eventually it was struck down as unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court. Can you go into a little bit about how that bill last May eventually leads into this constitutional crisis Taiwan is facing right now?
The legislature in Taiwan has always been at a disadvantage relative to the executive branch. They can call ministers to the legislature and put them on the stand and question them in public, but they don't have the ability to sanction ministers for saying things that aren't true. They don't have the ability either to subpoena other members of the government and force them to come before the legislature and testify under oath. And they don't have the power to acquire documents. And so there's actually a kind of a fundamental problem in the Taiwan system where the executive branch has much more power and information than the legislative branch. And so I think there's a valid concern by the majority in the legislature now that they want to strengthen legislative oversight powers. And this bill that passed in May was an attempt to do that. The problem is they passed it with just a KMT majority, and there wasn't much attempt to either negotiate with the DPP caucus or the executive branch itself. And they were a bit too ambitious. They pushed the limits of what was constitutionally allowed in this bill and opened themselves up then to a constitutional court challenge. My reading of the law, actually, and certainly the Constitutional Court, who's the real experts on this, agreed that big parts of that were sloppily written, or they were written in a way that violated some fundamental principles of the system. And so I think if you had a better crafted law, we'd be in a much better place right now.
So I want to move along here to the budgetary crisis, which very recently, with the Legislative Yuan's annual budget, the majority parties cut key portions out of the budget, which commentators say were politically motivated cuts. Can you talk a little bit about some of these critiques of the budgetary process, and then also how that budgetary crisis kind of plays into the larger ecosystem right now?
Let me start with the observation that the legislature does have the legal power to freeze or cut budgets. And that's really the one kind of clear constitutional authority they have over the executive branch. And so, without any other tools, this is the one way they're going to get the Lai administration actually to pay attention to them, to respond to their concerns. They would be, I think, foolish not to use this power to try to advance their own agenda. And as we mentioned earlier, they feel like they have a mandate to do that, given their collective majority in the legislature. I actually think I fault the Lai administration and President Lai himself for not recognizing the new political dynamic that is now in Taiwan, the new facts on the ground. If you don't have a majority in the legislature, you got to talk to the opposition, right? You actually need to consult with them, or this is the inevitable outcome. Your budget is probably going to be hacked to pieces if you just draft it without any sort of input from them. So I've criticized the DPP. Now let me criticize the opposition as well. The cuts that they've made have just been vindictive. There hasn't been a kind of clear rationale for going after certain parts of the government other than there are agencies that they just don't like. And they want to send a message to the DPP, and so they're trying to hit them where it hurts. This is not necessarily in the interests of Taiwan as a whole, but it may be in their own narrow partisan interests. So they're choosing party over country, I would say, with some of these cuts. In particular, the fact that they cut the defense budget is just mind-blowing to me. And there's going to be tremendous pressure on Taiwan to massively increase its defense budgets over the next couple years. So the optics of this are just terrible for the opposition. They are going to go down in Washington, D.C. with a reputation as being the anti-defense budget parties.
So there's kind of three core issues here: the Constitutional Court, the Investigation Power Bill, and then the budgetary crises. And with these three, we're actually only 1 year into a 4-year election cycle. So the Legislative Yuan nominally has majority over the next 3 years as well. Do you think that these sort of bills will be pushed through, or attempts will be made to push through these bills over the next 3 years?
Well, I think the key player here is the Taiwan People's Party, right? They are the swing votes in the legislature. The DPP, in fact, has worked in the past fairly closely with members of the TPP. And there's still an opportunity, I think, for President Lai or someone else in the party to reach out to the TPP and try to peel them off on certain issues away from the KMT. I think it would be better for Taiwan as a whole if the TPP were a swing party in the legislature rather than the KMT's kind of consistent and reliable junior partner in what's an anti-DPP coalition right now. And so a lot depends on what the TPP itself decides to do going forward and what the DPP is prepared to offer as the price for the TPP's cooperation. And so the current partisan makeup of the legislature is with us for at least probably the next 3 years. It would benefit everybody if they can find a way to come to some kind of compromise that supports Taiwan's core interests going forward.
So I want to play devil's advocate there just briefly before we go, because there is some belief out there that the Taiwan's People Party, the TPP, never wanted to negotiate with the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. How would you respond to those that believe that the TPP, through Kawanja's presidential campaign, really alienated themselves intentionally from the DPP?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is that the TPP doesn't, to my reading at least, doesn't seem to have a whole lot of ideological convictions. And so why else do people get into politics and found a political party? Well, they want power, they want offices, and they want the spoils of office. And so the DPP is in a position to offer some of those things. I was a little bit surprised that the TPP, both the other major parties, weren't just falling over themselves and fawning over the TPP and trying to get them, offering them bigger and bigger concessions because they hold the critical votes. In fact, let me suggest a couple possible, gifts or prizes that the DPP could have offered. One is positions in the Lai Ching-te cabinet, right? So Huang Guochang has been a fierce critic of the judiciary for a long time. Imagine offering him the Minister of Justice position and promising that you will have the power to run this ministry as you see fit. You can implement all of the reforms that you've been calling for a decade now if you offered an office in the cabinet. Or the DPP probably should have offered to support Huang Shanshan for the Speaker of the Legislature position. So I think they miscalculated, and they both ended up in a suboptimal position relative to where they could have been if they had cooperated in that vote.
Kharis Templeman, thank you very much for joining us. This has been very informative, and I hope we can continue talking about these issues over the next 3 years.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
From us at Zoom In, Zoom Out, thank you very much for watching. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus News by following us on social media. Thank you very much, and see you next time.